Now that we have a clear understanding of arrays, how to use arrays, as well as the methods that the array object and the JavaScript API provides us, let's talk about iterating over arrays. Now, this was alluded to when we learned about loops in the loop video. So here's where we're going to put iteration and loops together on top of data structures like an array. So we're going to go ahead and see how this works when we are looping over array lists of data. So let's start with this. We've got an array called elements. It's got fire, water, air, and earth in it. And we are going to go ahead and loop over this array using a good old for loop. Now, as we learned during looping, a for loop takes three statements in it, or three expressions. And those expressions are usually a counter. So let counter equals 0. Then a condition where we check to see if the counter is less than the elements dot length, because in this case we're trying to make sure that we don't go over the number of items in the array. So we get the length property of this elements array, and we're checking to make sure that we are only looping through as many times as we have items in the array. So make sure you understand that particular expression really well. We're saying counter so long as the counter is less than the length of this array, in other words, the number of items contained in the array, then let's go ahead and keep looping. And then, of course, we increment our counter as the final expression in our for loop. So let's run through this really quick, and let's just do a console.log, and then let's index our array elements. And we're going to index using the counter, and that's a really useful feature of a for loop. Because the for loop, if we started at 0, it's going to start at 0, and we know that our arrays are 0 indexed. Therefore, since they're 0 based, our first element starts at 0. And with the way a for loop works, because we start at 0, our counter will be at 0 the first time we loop, which means we can pull out the first element of this array, indexing using the counter. And because it's dynamic, and because it's self-contained, and the counter, or the for loop, takes care of incrementing the counter, we don't have to worry about anything, which makes iterating over an array extremely easy. So let's go ahead and see what our output is. We got fire, water, air, and earth, and we've only got 4 elements. It only iterated 4 times, and it started at the first index and made it all the way through to the last item in our array. So that's pretty simple. We are simply looping over an array using a for loop. Really easy. Now, when we were learning about looping, we also learned about the break and the continue functions inside, or that we can use within our looping structures. So in this case, we learned that break, when we use break within a loop, it goes ahead and breaks us completely out of the loop, stops execution of the loop, and lets us continue. So let's go ahead and do a console.log, and let's give us a message that shows that we're outside of the loop. Outside of our loop. Now we know that we have actually moved outside of our loop. And then, of course, we've got a console.log for everything that's inside of the loop, and we're indexing based on the counter using the array index syntax. So let's run it really quick. We should see all 4 of our elements, plus as soon as we're done looping and we've reached all 4 of our elements, then we hit our outside of the loop code and we move on with our program because our looping has concluded. Now let's talk about break. When we use break, we can actually, based on some condition, pull ourselves outside of the loop. So let's change our body of our loop really quick. Let's pull this out and let's capture the element that we are pulling out by indexing the array. So let current element equal, and now we're going to index the array, pull out the current element based on what index we're at, based on the counter and the number of times that we have looped through the array. Then we're just going to do a console.log on that element, and then here's where we're going to do some kind of a condition based on the data that we're getting. And this is where, back when we were learning about loops and we learned about the break condition, If for some reason we are iterating over an array and we are really only concerned about one item, and once we've found that item or up to that item, we're done and we really don't want to loop anymore, we can break out of that loop and move on with our program by doing that. So let's say that this current element, let's change the name of that and move it outside of our loop. And let's say let searched element equal, and we'll just go ahead and leave that one undefined because we haven't found it yet. And then let's add a search. Search equals, and let's say we are searching for air. So that's the search term we're looking for. So when we run into air, we don't want to continue on and continue with our looping. We just want to stop because we found the one we want. We're going to store the one we're looking for in this searched element, and then we're going to break out of the loop. So let's do searched element. We're going to change this to current. We're going to leave this as current element. So now we're going to say if search equals current element. So we're saying if the current element equals our search term, which is air, then we're going to go ahead and send our searched element and we're going to set it to our current element. So that way we have it outside of our loop. And then we're going to break. We're just going to break out of the loop and we're going to just stop. So now if we do a console.log, let's move our console.log up before our break so we know what our current element is. Let's go ahead and run this code really quick. We got fire, we got water, we got air, and we never get to earth because we break as soon as we run into air. And we can see that right here in our output. So now let's go ahead and do a console.log after we're outside. And let's go ahead and let's console.log our searched element and see if we actually captured the air element as we iterated over this loop, or as we iterated over the array. We got fire, water, air. So here we ran into air. We stored air for use outside of our loop because that's the one we were looking for. And then we broke out of our loop. And because the loop broke, in other words, we're not iterating anymore, we never get to earth because we don't care about earth. We were really only searching for air. And so we broke out of that looping. So that's what break does for us. And this is why break is interesting and useful, is because when you are iterating over huge amounts of data inside of an array, you can create a condition, and it doesn't have to be a search because we can use one of the built-in array functions to look for an item in here, like index of. But if we were doing something fancy, like if we were checking something against a database and we ended up getting what we wanted, then we could break out. Or maybe we only wanted partial data if we ran into something or some indicator. This is just kind of an example of how we might use break in an array. Now continue, on the other hand, the continue keyword right here, it allows us to continue on iterating without doing anything. So let's go ahead and move this console.log so we can see where we're breaking or where we're continuing out. So let's go ahead and do continue instead of break. Let's go ahead and run it and see what happens. Here we've got fire, water, earth, but no air in our list. And that is because what continue does is once we find what we're looking for, instead of just terminating our iteration and then picking up outside after that, what it does is it actually terminates the rest of the code in the loop based on this condition, and then it picks up at the next loop. So here you can see this console.log is never executed for air because we met the condition where the current element equals air. Therefore, we go ahead and store that element. We click continue to continue moving on through the iteration. We just don't finish executing the code. And then the next time in the next loop, we get to earth based on our array. Earth does not equal air, therefore it continues on. So that is the use of break and continue in a loop when we're working with data inside of an array. it can be extremely useful. Make sure you watch this video a couple of times to make sure you really understand how break and continue can be used as we're iterating over loops. Now, let's go ahead and let's comment this out. Let's comment the for loop out. And then let's see how we can iterate over an array. Let's comment that one out as well. Let's see how we can iterate over this array using just a while loop. Now for that, of course, we're going to have to set up our counters and do our incrementing ourselves, unlike a for loop. So let's go ahead and do let counter, and we'll go ahead and start it at 0. And then we're going to have to increment that counter on our own. So we'll need to set up a condition. We'll say while counter is less than elements.length, so that'll be the length of the array. Then we're going to go ahead and we're going to do a console.log, and we're just going to do an easy thing like we did before, where we're going to index the elements based on our counter. And when we execute this, we should see, oh, we're just getting in it. It's a infinite loop is what we got. And if you look at our code closely, you'll see it's because we're never incrementing our counter. That's why for loops are so useful, is that we don't have to worry about incrementing our counter because it does it for us. Whereas a while loop, we're going to have to. So after we're done at the end of our loop, let's go ahead and increment our counter. And let's go ahead and try that again. We got fire, water, air, and earth. So we've done a while loop over it, and now we've printed out everything. So let's go ahead and let's change this to a do while. Let's go ahead and take our while, cut it out, and then let's put it down here in our do while. Let's go ahead and execute it. We got fire, water, earth, air, and earth. We've been through everything. We looped with the do while. So really, if you remember from looping, the do while makes sure that our body gets executed at least once, whereas our while may not execute at all based on what our condition is. So if you don't remember that, make sure you go back and re-watch our looping videos on looping at the beginning of this module. All right, that's pretty much it. That's looping through arrays. So now we understand our array syntax. We understand how to index our arrays. We now know how to loop over our arrays using a for loop, a while loop, and a do while loop. And we also see that we can index our arrays dynamically using our indexing syntax and passing in our counter. And as long as our counter starts at 0, we can be assured that we are indexing all of the elements in our array, since our arrays are indexed at 0.